Good morning. So, one of the most popular shows on television right now is This Is Us. Best show ever. How many of you watch it? Okay. Well, then you know, for those of you who don't, it follows this family, these three siblings, throughout their lives. It tells their story over different periods of time, flashing back and forward to seeing essentially their whole life. And it deals with the everyday issues that come as we grow. It deals with their relationships. It deals with depression and adoption and midlife crises and weight loss and grief and 1,000 other things. There's something in this show for everyone to relate to. The stories aren't extravagant and far-fetched. What makes it popular is how normal they are. So that you can turn on an episode and start watching it and then call your family in and go, hey, look, this is us right here. I think it's a good name for the show. But this show is not the only place where we can find families like ours. The Bible is full of them. And so over the next few weeks, we're going to be taking a look at families in the Bible and see how they are like us. Now, we may be separated from them by many centuries and by vastly different cultures. But we'll find that they're not that different from us at all. They deal with some of the same issues that we deal with, the challenges. They have some of the same personalities that we have, the same strengths, and yes, even the same dysfunctions that we have in our families. And we can learn a lot from these early families of faith, the things to do and more often what not to do, to how to live in ways that lead us to God's blessing for our families. And so I thought we'd start with Jesus' family and how they were dealing with something that families of every type have to deal with. Changes in the family dynamic. Specifically in this case, their son is growing up. Now we find this out through this story of how they were leaving Jerusalem, going back to Nazareth after celebrating the Passover. And they were traveling in a caravan of people. Their families and friends were with them, some folks from their town. They all moved together. One, it was safer to do that in traveling through the desert and the wilderness, going from town to town. But also it was more fun. And every year they made this pilgrimage. So every year, Jesus would go and be playing in the caravan with his brothers, his sisters, his cousins, and that weird kid from down the street from them, because he always hung out with the weird kids. But this time is a little different, because when they settled down to eat, there was no Jesus there. Every parent's worst nightmare, where's my kid? And so they run around asking everybody where he is, and somebody, I guess, tells them, I don't even remember him being with us when we left Jerusalem. And so back they go, and they run around Jerusalem looking for him, asking everywhere, have you seen my son? And it says they did this for 3 days. For 3 days. And then where do they find him? In the temple, having conversations about the scripture with the rabbis. Now, if these were my parents, I would have been crucified long before that angry crowd. There would have been a scene of epic proportions when they walked into that temple. what I love in this scene is that doesn't happen to Jesus. Nobody breaks out the belt. Nobody grabs him by the ear and hauls him off. It doesn't say that he was grounded for life. Instead, we get this response. Son, why have you treated us like this? Notice, there's no insults, no, you idiot, you irresponsible, so-and-so. Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you. And here's the thing I find more amazing. They let him answer them. I would have gotten, don't talk to me right now. I can't with you. They let him answer. And what he says is kind of amazing. He says, why were you searching for me? Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house? And there's no response after that. It says they did not understand what he was saying to them. Then he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. But his mother treasured all these things in her heart. See, every family goes through these times like this, these transitions, these changes that alter how we relate to one another. And to be honest, we're usually not prepared for them because they happen before we know it, and we find ourselves not so much initiating these changes, but reacting to them. Oftentimes badly. This is the moment where Mary and Joseph realize Jesus isn't a child anymore. He's not that little boy running around playing with his brothers and his sisters and his cousins. He's growing up, and he's starting to embrace the life that God sent him to embrace. And when Mary is hit with this realization, it says this. She treasured all these things in her heart. Now, what does that mean? To treasure all these things in her heart. It's more than just file this away as a fond memory. It comes from the Greek word diaterio, which means to watch carefully, to guard, to hold on to. In the context of this, where Mary treasures it in her heart, she's taking this experience and she's holding on to it. It means to ponder, to consider, to mull it over in your head, to pray over it, to look for the deeper meaning in it, to seek God's hand at work. This is what Mary does with this experience. She doesn't react to it immediately. She doesn't stomp her feet and say, I'm not ready for this. He's still my little boy. She treasures this stuff in her heart. In other words, she goes to God with it and starts to work it out. So I'm talking about children growing up. But there are changes in family dynamics all the time. And they come in a variety of ways. Maybe you're the empty nester, and now you have to relate to your spouse and your kids in a different way because they're no longer under your roof, but your husband or your wife still is. Or maybe one of you lost a job. Now you're dealing with the stress of that. Or maybe one of you is going back to work, and that's changing everything and what has to be done around the house. Maybe you're taking care of your parent who is sick now. Maybe one of you is going through a midlife crisis, and suddenly there's a motorcycle in the garage that wasn't there before. Or you're retiring, Or, look, you know what these changes are. You've been through them. And here's the example that Mary sets for us. We can just react to these changes out of our anxiety. We could ignore them, pretend they don't exist, or we can fight the changes to keep the things the way they always were. But none of that ever works, does it? That usually leads to fracturing in relationships. What Mary does here serves to strengthen relationships. What Mary does here helps to open her family up, to seeing the hand of God at work in the midst of them. And this is what she does. She takes time to ponder it, to consider it, to pray over it, to bring it to God. This is why it's so important to treasure these things in our heart, not treat them as fond memories, but to temper our reactions to them with careful reflection and prayer. Now, for Mary, it was kind of easy to see what was going on because she had God's promises to her from the moment she conceived Jesus. But her and Joseph still had to deal with their son growing up. Regardless of whether he's the Messiah or not, that's their boy. And something's changing. And so they had to figure out, how do we encourage him in this? How do we still parent him in this? They knew God's hand was at work in specific ways, but they still had to do the work. We don't always get such clear messages from God about the changes and the transitions that we go through, do we? No, we find ourselves in Mary and Joseph's position, not fully understanding what's happening. This is all the more reason for us to treasure these things in our heart, to seek God in the midst of these ever-evolving relationships. Because as we do that, that's how God helps us to relate to one another in ways that draw us closer to each other and closer to God together. So whatever changes you are going through, whether they're good ones that you celebrate or others that aren't so great and have you worried, let us follow Mary's example here and ponder these things in our hearts. Take them to God and let Him guide us in how we respond. Because that will not just help us, but will help our families as well. Amen.